How did it get there? Well, as you probably know, very briefly, cannabis is the oldest medicine known to man. It's been around for centuries. About 5,000 years is the known recording, starting in China and then spreading along the Silk Road into Europe many hundreds of years ago. And it was well accepted as a medicine up to 1930s, something like that. It was a very accepted medicine, a botanical medicine. Most of medicine in those days was botanical products. But then it began to go out of favor in the 1930s for two reasons. One, because there was the modern pharmaceutical industry started and botanical medicines were going out of fashion. But secondly, there was a unfortunate political debate around it. Starting with the Opium Conference in 1927, I think, it was a precursor of the United Nations, were trying to stop the international trade in narcotics. And it was actually a delegate from Egypt who stood up and said he wanted cannabis incorporated as a narcotic and equally restricted. And that went through. It wasn't on the agenda. It had no evidence base behind it, but nevertheless, it went through. And then that was the start of its demonization, I suppose you could say, which then got politically demonized thereafter, mainly from the United States, where the Federal Bureau of Narcotics chief called Harry Anslinger had began a campaign against cannabis, which he called marijuana in those days. It was a very nasty, racist, anti-Mexican, anti-black campaign. Which he did for purely political reasons. This is historically factual. It's not me speculating. In cahoots with a newspaper magnate called J. Randolph Hearst, and they had a very successful campaign against cannabis. And as a result of that campaign, cannabis remained rather demonized, seen as anti-establishment for up to the present day, really. And then finally, in 1961. United Nations and the Single Convention of Drugs and Narcotics put cannabis in the most restrictive section, and that forced the countries, which are all in the world except 4, I believe, to put forward their own misuse of drugs regulations. In the UK, we had the Misuse of Drugs Act in 1971, and that still is in play. And it's only in the last very few years that some countries, now 50, have begun to overcome the UN Convention and license cannabis as a medical use. And as you know, a few countries are licensing cannabis for recreational use, but we're mainly talking about medical use today. And there's 50 countries in the world where now it's medically allowed to be prescribed in various ways of doing it, some decriminalized, some more formally legalized, but nevertheless 50 countries are now able to use medical cannabis. So that's very briefly, it's a history.